This is an article from the Reformed Presbyterian published in July of 1838 entitled A Short Account of the Old Presbyterian Dissenters under the Inspection of the Reformed Presbyteries of Scotland, Ireland, and North America. The following narrative was published many years ago by the Reformed Presbytery of Scotland. It contains statements of many important facts which will be interesting to our readers and which are found in but few of the books to which we presume they generally have access. Section 1. The several names by which the old dissenters have been known and distinguished. The old Presbyterian dissenters have assumed and received the appellation of dissenters on account of the part that their forefathers acted at the Revolution in 1689, while they openly and candidly dissented from the public deeds of the nation's representatives in both church and state, considering these deeds as involving a mournful departure from former laudable attainments. The epithet old has ordinarily been prefixed to signify they are of longer standing as a distinct body than any other denomination of Presbyterians which have separated from the established church. In some parts of the country, especially in Ireland, they have been called Covenanters because of their avowed attachment to the National Covenant of Scotland and the Solemn League and Covenant of the Three Kingdoms. Various nicknames are frequently given to them by others. They have been called Whigs, a term which, it is well known, has often been applied to the zealous friends of civil or religious liberty. Cameroonians, from the Reverend Richard Cameron, who fell at Ersmoss, in Kyle, on the 20th of July, 1680, by the sword of his bloody persecutors, while he and a number of his followers, being suddenly and furiously attacked, were nobly defending their lives and religious liberties. Mountain men, on account of their adhering to the same cause with those who supported and countenanced the faithful preaching of the gospel on the mountains and moors of Scotland during the persecution, and because they themselves, in want of better conveniency, have often been obliged, even since the Revolution, to administer ordinances in the open fields, though this is not so much the case now as it once was. Macmillanites, from the name of the first minister who espoused their cause after the Revolution, and whose immediate descendants of the second and third generation are yet employed in ministering among them. Were the intention of the imposer good, all these nicknames might be considered as very harmless. There is, however, one very forbidding epithet, that is, anti-government people, which some have bestowed on the dissenters, but which they justly reject with abhorrence, inasmuch as they firmly believe and have also repeatedly shown from the press that it is totally inapplicable to them, unless indeed it be either from gross ignorance of their avowed principles or from pure malice, wishing to make them as obnoxious before the world as possible. It is difficult to conceive how this term could ever be applied to the old dissenters. So far are they from being unfriendly to civil government amongst men, that they have uniformly and strenuously contended that it is a precious ordinance instituted by the great Creator of heaven and earth, and comprehended in the revelation of His will, in which the ends of it are evidently declared to be His own glory, the external protection of His church, where the true religion is known and professed, and the good of mankind at large. Nor do dissenters object to the particular kind of civil government, as if one form of government only could be the ordinance of God. The great matters on which their scruples turn are the terms or fundamental conditions on which persons are admitted into places of power and trust in the nation. Could they, in judgment and conscience, approve of these, an ideal necessarily implied in owning any government, so long as any language retains its usual meaning? Did they find these terms of advancement agreeable to the revealed will of God, which they consider as the standard of human conduct in civil as well as in religious societies, and could they once be persuaded in their own minds that they are consistent with the fundamental laws of the kingdom in the purest times of that Reformation, until which they still wish to adhere, instead of differing from the other inhabitants of Britain concerning their acknowledgments of the present government, they would find a peculiar pleasure in concurring with them. But plainly perceiving that the Revolution terms of advancement to power are of a very different description, the old dissenters cannot in judgment approve, but find themselves indeed under the disagreeable necessity of openly entering their protest against national backsliding, whether it be in church or state. Doing so, they consider themselves as proceeding on the great and generally admitted principle that human society is formed by mutual consent, and not by compulsion, or by one party lording it over another. If this be the case, Dissenters cannot consistently be refused the privilege of openly avowing their satisfaction with the fundamental laws of that great national society, to which, in the persons of their worthy ancestors, they heartily gave their consent, and to which they still adhere in their own persons. Neither can they be justly blamed, after using the best means of information in their power, for allowing the dictates of their own mind, under the direction of a higher rule, in dissenting from the deeds of those who, at the Revolution, receded from the former laudable attainments and reorganized the society on principles entirely different. But let it always be carefully observed that after publicly entering their dissent from the Revolution settlement of the Church and State, and candidly assigning their reasons, it ever hath been, and they trust ever shall be, the study of the old dissenters, to live peaceably and inoffensively without giving disturbance to small or great, nor do they wish this to be admitted on their bare assertion. Let stubborn facts bear witness. Let their conduct undergo the severest investigation for 100 years back, and it will be found that in no rebellions, seditions, or public disturbances of any kind have they ever had a share or taken any active part. They never entertained the idea of either opposing public measures or propagating their own principles by violence, nor had they ever the remotest thought of injuring either the person or the property of any man, high or low, rich or poor, however far he may differ from them in his opinions. On the contrary, they sincerely wish, by every consistent means in their power, to promote the peace and happiness of human society, wherever Providence may order their lot. With that shadow, then, of either reason or candor, they may still be called the anti-government people. The impartial public shall be left to judge. Section 2. The rise and progress of the old dissenters. As the dissenters hold no new opinions with respect to either civil or religious matters, it is obvious that they cannot, without any propriety, be denominated a sectary or new upstart society. If we carefully consider the well-authenticated histories of our memorable Reformation from 1638 to 1649, if we examine the printed Acts of Assembly during that period and also the Acts of Parliament fixing the conditions of civil rule in the nation, if we candidly peruse the subordinate standards of the Church of Scotland, adopted at that time as parts of the covenanted uniformity of the three kingdoms of Scotland, England, and Ireland, if we peruse also the Informatory Vindication, Cloud of Witnesses, Plain Reasons, and other books of a similar description, and compare with all these the judicial testimony of the Reformed Presbytery, the native conclusion will be that the origin of the old Presbyterian dissenters under the inspection of said presbytery may be safely traced to the Reformation and Covenanted Church of Scotland, when she looked forth fair as the morning at the year 1649. The old dissenters evidently stand on the same ground with that famous church, though they must confess themselves the unworthy descendants of such noble ancestors. From the begun decline in 1650 to the restoration of Charles II in 1660, the dismal clouds of Cromwell's usurpation, enthusiastic independency, and public resolutions, together with sinfully qualified tolerations and indulgences, rendered it extremely difficult to recognize the faithful witness for the preceding Reformation attainments. Yet even during that period there was a considerable number whose unextinguished zeal for the Reformation influenced them to stand boldly forward and display a banner for the truth. This necessary duty was performed by solemn remonstrances and protestations against the public resolutions and other backslidings of the time. From the Restoration to the year 1688, when the Revolution took place, comprehending the 28 years of the most inhuman and bloody persecution, the Church's testimony for the word of Christ's patience was honorably supported by the faithful preaching of the gospel in the fields. After those ministers who honestly avowed their attachment to the former Reformation, which had been silenced, by public authority, and ejected from their parish churches, by solemn declarations and testimonies openly exhibited against the prevailing abominations of the times, by the sufferer's informatory vindication in connection with Mr. Shield's Hind Let Loose, and the Reverend Mr. Rennick's testimony against toleration, given to some ministers in Edinburgh a short while before his death, and by the earnest contendings and dying speeches of the martyrs who sealed their steadfast adherence to the truths of Christ with their blood, shed on the scaffolds and on the high places of the field. From this noble race of martyrs the line of succession was still preserved at the memorable Revolution in 1688. The last ordained minister who, previous to this period, had gone out and in before them, saying in his Master's name, "This is the way, walk ye in it," was the aforementioned Reverend James Rennick, who suffered at the Grass Market of Edinburgh February 17, 1688. After his death, Mr. Alexander Shields, author of the Hind Let Loose, etc., and a preacher who had labored a considerable time along with Mr. Rennick in the supporting of the same testimony, continued to preach among the people who had lately lost their young champion and much beloved pastor. While matters were in this situation, a Mr. Thomas Linning, who had been formerly sent over to Holland for finishing his education and receiving ordination, came home to Scotland. He, together with a Mr. William Boyd, who had also lately come from Holland, joined with Mr. Shields. These three together administered gospel ordinances for a few months longer, and renewed the covenants at Lesmahago amongst the poor afflicted people above mentioned. But when the General Assembly met at Edinburgh in 1689, the three ministers, deserting their former flock and relinquishing in many respects, at least, their former principles, gave in their accession to the judicatories of the Revolution Church. Thus the people who wished closely to adhere to the Reformation attainments were left as sheep without a shepherd. Having long before this time formed themselves into praying societies, they still continued these, and had, at particular times, a general correspondence of all the societies together, in order to ascertain the state of matters through the body at large, and to cultivate a closer acquaintance with one another. In this very trying and rather singular situation, without any change of sentiment, they steadfastly adhered to the very same principles which were openly espoused and solemnly ratified by the Covenanted Church of Scotland in the times of her purest Reformation, as can be clearly and fully proven from their written deeds and declarations. Thus they remained for about the space of 16 years, till in 1706 the Reverend John Macmillan, former minister of Balmahy in Galloway, having previously to this left the established church, acceded to them and espoused their cause. Receiving a unanimous call to be their minister, he took the pastoral charge of them, and labored amongst them for many years, after with much acceptance, as hundreds of respectable characters have attested both before and since his death. After Mr. Macmillan had labored long by himself, he and his people at last received the accession of the Reverend Thomas Nairn, who had been in connection with the Secession Church, but for reasons which were published in the World, had dissented from them. Mr. Macmillan and he, with some ruling elders who had been regularly ordained before, and who held the same principles, formed and constituted a presbytery in the name of Christ, the alone King and head of his church, on the 1st of August, 1743, under the title of the Reformed Presbytery. This title it still bears, not that they consider themselves as better than any other men, or as having in their own persons arrived at higher degrees of perfection. Such thoughts they never entertained, but purely for this reason, that it is at least their honest intention faithfully to adhere to the whole of our Reformation attainments in both church and state, without knowingly dropping any part of these. On this account, it is presumed they may, justly enough, be called the Reformed or Reformation Presbytery, while in another point of view they might with equal propriety be denominated the Dissenting Presbyterians. A Mr. Alexander Marshall, who had formerly got the ordinary education of regular students in divinity, having passed the usual pieces of trial with approbation before the Reformed Presbytery, was by them licensed to preach the gospel in the month of April 1744. He soon received a call, was regularly ordained, and took his seat with the other two as co-presbyter. After this, the Reformed Presbytery from time to time received small accessions to the number of both their ministers and people. Having obtained help of God, they continue to this day, witnessing none other things than what many thousands in that once famous and Reformed Church of Scotland have witnessed before them.